Hello, my friend. So, today I just want to bring something I found out when I was digging information about my lineage and finding out more about it. So, I started looking into slavery and the history of the Portuguese slavery to understand where they brought slaves from and if it was just black slaves. I did decide to look into it just because my father talks about having Indian heritage, and my guides are mentioning more like Chinese heritage. So I started looking into it just to understand if there were Chinese being brought to the West back then. And when, sadly enough, not interestingly enough, sorry, maybe sadly enough, more the word, Portuguese didn't just do slave traffic, human traffic, and human trade from Africa. I also did from Morocco. They also did from China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Timor, and Japan and Korea. I think there's a lot about slavery that is hard to understand. One thing is slavery, the values and morals back then were different. And there was a lot of this exploiting the other. It's like, so let's say all the slaves were more like exploits of war, then they would become slaves. Or they would come and raid a village and then everyone would be enslaved, or they would just kill. Or different people had different values on what they did. But there's that. So when I was looking into the history of Portuguese slave, I came across some interesting things. One was the history of Portugal. All of this is very tricky because history is taught by the winner. So they talk about history the way they want. So it's not exactly accurate at all. And then there's a part that a lot of this history are based in European database, European books, ledgers and things like that, and not based on the other side at all. So it would be interesting to see what is the data on the other side to see how accurate it is. But basically, Portuguese history, the Portuguese war in Portugal, always Portugal, obviously, it was part of the Iberian province, let's call it like that. And the Iberian province did include Spain and Portugal. And it was occupied by different tribes, not even tribes, populations. There's different names. I'm not a history person, to be honest. I'll just put the links below for things I found, so you can just dive into it if you want to. But I'm not exactly very keen into history. And at some point then Morocco, the Moors occupied the Iberian Peninsula. And they occupied there for a while. And the Iberians, the Christian Iberians, were turned into slaves. Later on, when the Iberians, so Portugal and Spain, decided, and the different little kingdoms all over Iberia, decided to take back the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors, they turned the Christian Moors into slaves. So we're talking about the Iberians being slave first, then we have they turned the Moors into slave, and then from there, so you had always those Moors slaves, and then from there, later on, when Portugal decided to venture the ocean, the world, they first wanted to see how far did the Moors dominate. And they basically did raid Canary Islands and brought some of the natives from Canary Islands as slaves. Then went further and got people from Africa, Africans as slaves, and brought back, but obviously weren't exactly part of Morocco, Moors. From there they kept going, and until they obviously reached India, China, and Japan. The thing about that side of the world is that there was a lot of raids, and they would, it's just barbaric and horrible. Basically they would, so savage, and then they would go around the world calling everyone else savage, but so savage. They would just go and raid villages and areas and just kidnap people and made them into slaves, and this would include children. So that didn't happen just in Africa, it did happen also in China, and they would just kidnap people and turn them into slaves, and then they would buy Japanese women to sell them as sexual slaves. So when I think of slaves, to be honest, I feel like that is much worse. Being a sexual slave is probably worse than being a labor slave. But there was a lot of this type of slaves. So the slaves that Portugal had, and this registration of slaves in different places, did include people from Asia as well. So it's a very sad story, and obviously that did take a long time to things to be banished. And in that way, looking into my background, then I was like, okay, then my lineage can have anything. You can actually have literally anything, and I feel more lost than ever. So I think I will probably explore a DNA testing. I'm just not quite sure how accurate it's going to be, because I'm definitely going to have lineage more from Africa and other places like that. So yeah, if you have done a DNA testing, just share below your experience and if it was accurate, if you think it was accurate, and everything else. Thank you. Bye bye.